George Washington, the Commander-in-Chief, the Founding Father, Papa America. Whatever you know him by, you know him as the first President of the United States. And in today's video, we will be looking at the American Cincinnatus.
Hi, I'm Gray Bradbury, and in this series, we're going to be going over all the presidents of the United States of America, looking into their policies, their accomplishments, and their failures. We're going to be starting off this series with potentially the most popular of the American presidents, George Washington.
Washington's claim to fame before his turn as president was commanding the Continental Army and leading them to victory against the English. However, he first served for the British as an officer during the French and Indian War, where he led an expedition gone wrong. His forces, allied with some Mingo Native Americans, accidentally attacked a peace diplomatic envoy the French were sending to parley with the British. The incident led the French to start aggression against England both in the colonies and back in Europe, largely starting the global 7 Years' War. Nice one, George. During the American Revolution, however, George Washington proved an excellent leader, despite losing many battles. Washington understood that as long as he kept his forces mostly intact and harassed British supply lines and secured a French alliance, the British would be nearly forced to give up the 13 colonies and give the Americas their independence. George's resolve in the face of constant failures and his ability to whip mostly undisciplined men into a standing army is a key factor in American victory in the war. Following independence, the newly formed government under the Articles of Confederation were tested, and their limited power, along with the desire of Hamiltonian Federalists to strengthen the national government from the get-go, and the power of Federalist newspapers, the Constitutional Congress was able to, illegally, ratify the Constitution, which called for a chief executive. The first chief executive to be chosen for the job was none other than George Washington. The U.S. has practically always been polarized, and from the beginning, political factions emerged with competing interests. On one side, you had the urban, entrepreneurial Federalists, who were industrious and capitalists, trying to buttress the federal government to establish trade between the states. And on the other, you had the anti-Federalists, mostly agrarian farmers, working-class folk with an elevated slave-owning planter class at the top. The anti-Federalists wanted government as local as possible and distrusted the federal government. Washington strode the line well between the two factions, giving both a seat in the cabinet, and the form of Chief Federalist himself, Alexander Hamilton, granted the responsibility of Secretary of the Treasury, and his archenemy, the Virginia man, anti-Federalist Thomas Jefferson, as his Secretary of State. Despite his supposed non-partisanship, Washington definitely favored the Federalists in almost all areas concerning policy, examples including Hamilton's desire to form the Bank of the United States to act as the center for the American economy, and Washington increased the size of the military, formally adopting his old Continental Army as the United States Army. These achievements came at the cost of anti-Federalist uproar, especially following the famed Whiskey Rebellion, where the implementation of a tax on distilled spirits aroused Pennsylvanian farmers to rioting and insurgency. The federal government, with a force led by Alexander Hamilton himself, flexed their might and sent the farmers home. But the crackdown was enough, and anti-Federalist politicians such as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison jumped on the opportunity to put in motion the drafting and eventual ratification of the Bill of Rights. Washington, showing his character, grew tired of the political battles and spoiled relationships that came along with the rhetoric. Perhaps his greatest accomplishment, then, was peacefully stepping down, transitioning out of power without the need for bloodshed, and voluntarily and nobly doing so. Washington set the presidential standard for how one should behave in office, and we to this day instinctually judge our president's behavior by comparing them to George. While he wasn't a perfect man, as he did some pretty awful things by modern standards, including pulling out the teeth of some of his slaves and using them as his own in a creepy wooden device, and just owning slaves in general, it's folly to judge people based on the moral standards of our time, as by comparison to practically every head of state during Washington's presidency, he was one of the best and still remains one of the highest regarded figures in American politics today.
So I'm a firm believer that we should all take an individual lesson from history. We can apply the lessons that we get from history and put them onto our lives and apply them in a way that makes our lives better. So what can we learn from George Washington? The first thing I think we can learn is to not give up, is to not let failure get us down. So he lost many battles in the Revolutionary War. He lost Germantown, Brandywine, Fort Washington. But he didn't let those get in the way of the strategic end goal of victory. So we all have a goal in our lives that we want, but sometimes we let failure stop us, or the fear of failure stop us from even starting. So I think the important thing there is to just keep rebounding and keep getting up after failures. That way we may be victorious in the end. We don't know. Second thing I think we can learn from George Washington is to always pay attention to both sides in a debate. Always listen to both sides. And he did this well between Hamilton and Jefferson, and he played the line between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists very well, to the point where he was sort of known for being a middleman, a nonpartisan. Even though he was definitely favored the Federalists, he still gave the Anti-Federalists an ear. So I think in this current political situation in America, I think both sides can do well from genuinely listening to the other side. Well, that wraps up the video on George Washington. Next up is John Adams, so please leave a like and subscribe if you want to get that when it comes out. Peace.